So today's webinar is all about providing you with further information about our product and the science that sits behind it. I'm joined today by Professor Richard Mythen, who is our inventor and lead scientist. He is also head of human nutrition at the University of Auckland. He has a background in plant genetics, but has been involved in the designing and running of many clinical trials alongside clinicians and hospital patients for over 25 years. So he's got great strength and depth in that area. We're also joined by Steve Morrison. Steve is a medical biochemist and has over 30 years experience of clinical research and has significant experience in the functional food space and its associated regulation. We also have Aaron Shornack with us, who's Director of Health Communications, and Jess Flowers, who is our research lead, both of whom you may have come across if you've asked us questions or have been involved in any of our focus groups or have had questions about our product. So a little bit about the company history and our background. So SmarterNaturally is actually owned by the Smarter Food Company, and we're a spin out from the Quadram Institute, which is one of the UK's leading food and health research organisations. And it's where the science behind our product has stemmed from. And Richard, together with many of the scientists at the Quadram Institute, have worked for decades at the forefront of food research. So our soup is made using a unique proprietary broccoli called GRextra, and it contains roughly 5 times more glucoraphanin than any standard broccoli variety. And our research, which has been part funded by the UK government, has been to look at how the impact of glucoraphanin, what impact it can have on fasting blood glucose, as well as looking at the other potential health benefits of this compound. And as a company, our aim is to try and secure a proprietary health claim from the European Food Safety Authority once we have sufficient scientific evidence to do so. And then we'd be looking to seek regulatory approval in other countries around the world. So I'm now going to hand over to Richard, who will give you an insight into the history behind the broccoli.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give a very quick summary of the history behind the broccoli and a little bit of the underpinning science of why we think consuming this broccoli will promote health. Now, as you're probably aware, within the kind of popular press, broccoli is often referred to as superfood. But it's really important to know that not all broccolis are the same. And we developed the GRextra broccoli over many years. And this broccoli is distinctly different from any other broccoli you can purchase. Although it looks and tastes the same as other broccolis, it is distinctly different. Now, its origin is from a wild brassica species that actually myself and a few colleagues collected in the early 1980s, actually in Sicily. And that species contained very high levels of glucoraphanin. And funded largely by the UK government, we developed by conventional breeding techniques this new variety of broccoli. And we had 2 goals in this program. The first goal was to develop the new broccoli with 3, 4, 5 times the amount of glucoraphanin. And the second goal was to understand how it exerted effects on human health. And over the last 30, 35 years, we've been engaged in both those aims and objectives. Next slide, Laura. So how did we develop this? Well, it used traditional breeding techniques. It took 10, maybe 15 years to develop that broccoli. We had early prototypes maybe in about 2000, 2005. But the actual final varieties we're using in our soup product have really only been developed in the last 5 or 6 years. The first variety we created was called Beneforte broccoli. And for a time that was available to purchase as a fresh product. And that contained 2 or 3 times the amount of glucoraphanin. Now, working, trying to get a health claim on a fresh product is actually extremely difficult. And I don't think there are any fresh products in the world that have health claims. And that's partly because it's very difficult to very carefully control the chemical content of fresh products because they're impacted by weather and other environmental effects. And in fact, this year we've got a very hot, dry year, and that's going to have quite important changes on fresh products. So what we then decided to do was to create a broccoli that contained even more glucoraphanin and also a manufacturing process that would ensure consistent levels of glucoraphanin in every portion and also maintain all those other nutrients and make them very simply available for a very simple kind of cooking process you may do in your kitchen. You just add hot water to this. So the GRextra broccoli we have now, it contains about 5 times as much glucoraphanin than any other broccoli you'd buy in the shops. And 5 times was about our goal. Because if you look at all what we call epidemiological evidence, these are very large studies of maybe thousands or tens of thousands of people. People who eat about 5 portions of broccoli or other cruciferous vegetables a week tend to remain much healthier than people who don't eat any. So this is why that 5 times is a good target to aim for. Now, the decrease in fasting blood glucose is a result we observed in a clinical trial. It was a 12-month clinical trial where the volunteers in the study were just consuming 1 bowl of broccoli soup per week. And the individuals were actually, they didn't know it, and we didn't know which one. They were either consuming the high glucoraphanin broccoli or normal broccoli. And we saw changes in the fasting blood glucose, particularly in the high glucoraphanin broccoli, although of course there were some changes in the other broccoli as well. Now, I'm going to try and explain a little bit about the science. One thing that's very interesting about broccoli is that it seems to have health benefits on a whole range of chronic diseases, a number of different cancers, heart disease, some neurodegenerative diseases, as well as type 2 diabetes. So how can that happen? How can one food have health benefits on all those different types of diseases? And this is because the glucoraphanin in broccoli acts at a very basic level in our bodies. So in every cell of our body, we have structures called mitochondria. And you can think of mitochondria as batteries or little engines in our cells. And it's the mitochondria that process our foods. So when we eat carbohydrates like potato or pasta, the carbohydrate is broken down into glucose, and the glucose enters the mitochondria, and the mitochondria burns it up. And it's very much like a process in a fire. It burns it up, it uses oxygen, it produces carbon dioxide just like a fire, and it produces energy. When we eat fats, the fats are broken down to fatty acids. The fatty acids enter the mitochondria, and it does exactly the same. It generates energy. And the same with proteins. Protein can be broken down to amino acids. The amino acids enter. The problem with mitochondria, these little engines, is that as we age, they stop working very efficiently. They slow down. They produce less energy. And that's a little bit why, as we approach middle age or late middle age, we often feel a little bit, we don't feel we have as much energy as when we're in our younger selves. Now, what happens if it's not burning up the energy, burning up those foodstuffs to make energy? They push them out of the mitochondria back into our bodies. And that's also why in middle age, we might have a tendency to put weight on, and why we might put deposits around our arteries, why we make tissues very susceptible to carcinogenesis, and why our metabolism stops working very efficiently. So we're not burning up our glucose, it's actually remaining in our blood. So as we age, our mitochondria become less efficient, respiration slows down, and we feel we have less energy. Instead of glucose and fatty acids burning up, they remain and accumulate in our body. And it's a bit like our mitochondria have become rusty. Next slide, please, Laura. Now, the glucoraphanin in the soup gets converted in our bodies to a compound called sulforaphane. And sulforaphane helps our mitochondria to work well again. It's a bit like oiling a rusty engine. It's a bit like retuning our basic metabolism. And the GRextra broccoli provides a glucoraphanin, and that's get converted to sulforaphane, and this reduces your risk of a range of chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes. And it's like retuning our engines. And it's particularly good if you combine it with exercise. And in fact, exercise has a very similar effect to consuming glucoraphanin and sulforaphane. Next slide, Laura. So this is a kind of summary of how it works. The broccoli is very high in glucoraphanin. In our gut, the glucoraphanin is converted to sulforaphane. Sulforaphane is absorbed into our bloodstream and it enters the liver. And in the liver, it switches on something called NFR2 gene expression. And you can think of this as our body's natural antioxidant system. It switches on our endogenous system. It's retuning the energy. It's getting us all working better again. It's retuning his metabolism. And one effect of that is to help normalize our blood glucose, but it also has other health benefits. So next slide, Laura, and I think I'll pass over to Steve.
Yes, it's Steve next.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My role in the next 3 or 4 slides is to just give you a bit more depth around the science on glucoraphanin and sulforaphane that kind of preceded where we are with the soup. So the paper that's referenced in this slide summarizes a broad piece of research that was done by a Swedish group looking at experiments in different settings. So they looked at isolated liver cells, which we call in vitro work, and they looked at then in animal and human studies, which is in vivo work. And as you heard, they focused on sulforaphane, which is the compound that our glucoraphanin is converted into within the guts after we consume it. Now, one of the many roles of our liver in the body is to act as a fuel reservoir. So our liver is releasing sugar back into our system when we're not eating, for instance, overnight. And the liver can produce that glucose from either stored glycogen or from taking waste products like amino acids, which are the building blocks of every protein that we eat. So these researchers found that sulforaphane reduced the capability of these isolated liver cells, the in vitro experiments, to produce glucose by around 50%, which is quite impressive. And that was switching off certain genes that they were able to link to this gene expression factor that Richard talked about, NRF2. They went on to look at some animal models, and the ability was further demonstrated in these animal models by preventing the animals from developing glucose intolerance. This was in rats who were being fed a high-fat diet. So it was kind of protective of them developing glucose intolerance. And then they went on to look at a human study with around 100 people, where they dosed them every day with a lower dose of sulforaphane. And what they found is that in the worst off people, the people who had dysregulated diabetes, now some of you will understand what the levels are for pre-diabetes, but dysregulated diabetes, we're talking about an HbA1c of 6.7% or 50 millimoles per mole. So these were really quite significant. And they found in obese people with that level of dysregulation, there were positive changes in HbA1c and fasting glucose. So very promising. And what this all tells us is how important it is with something like our soup to deliver the glucoraphanin intact, to get it to where we want it to be in our guts, to not have it destroyed by cooking. If we chop and floret broccoli and pop it in a pan, the enzyme that's in there is going to denature that sulforaphane and that glucoraphanin. So we want to be able to preserve that in the way that we deliver this soup. Next slide, please, Laura. I also want to make clear that, you know, this isn't all new research. Sometimes we've been asked by consumers, you know, what comes before what we did? And, you know, if you look at glucoraphanin and sulforaphane, they've been researched in areas well beyond blood sugar control. The leading website for scientific publications, something called PubMed, if you search in there for glucoraphanin or sulforaphane, you'll find 3,000 papers on research with these two compounds. And some of that is a large body of evidence, as Richard said, around anti-cancer properties with solid state tumors like prostate and breast cancer. But, you know, also a body of research in cholesterol lowering, blood pressure, asthma, and autism. And as Richard was saying, this mechanism of retuning our metabolism underpins all of these effects in all of these areas because of what it's doing to our body's metabolism. And that package of work went back over a period of about 25 years. So it doesn't begin with where we are, we're building on that work. Next slide, Laura. Now, as Richard alluded to, the fact that the study that we were conducting when we found this effect on blood sugar with the high glucoraphanin broccoli, it was actually a study in prostate cancer that was being done. When men who were on active surveillance, which is where they're not being treated. If you're familiar with prostate cancer, there are long periods, it's slow to develop, where people aren't treated. And those people on active surveillance were given one of three products, either a placebo soup, the broccoli soup, a standard broccoli soup, or a high glucoraphanin broccoli soup. And they were only given that once a week, as Richard said, for a period of a year, and it was then extended on beyond that. At the end of the trial, they had a biopsy of the prostate, which is obviously an uncomfortable thing to go through. But then there's researchers were able to look at the expression of the genes in that sample of prostate tissue. And what they found is even in the placebo subjects, several hundred gene changes were occurring over that 12 months. And that these were genes that were associated with cancer progression pathways. And yet in the broccoli soup subjects, these changes had been effectively reduced or attenuated, and that was dependent on the dose. So the higher glucoraphanin group had less changes to the genes. And although this study wasn't powered to look at the clinical endpoints of disease progression in these subjects, there were about 10 subjects who progressed during the time on the trial, and there was an inverse relationship between the glucoraphanin exposure and whether they went on to have some kind of progression. So a body of evidence that's substantial that's gone before. Next slide, Nora. Now, building upon that, as I think some of you are aware, we are now doing our own research. We've started with a small randomized double-blind controlled trial, which is the gold standard for research. And we're looking to assess the effectiveness of the product in pre-diabetic subjects by taking it once a week on fasting blood glucose levels. And what I would say is that the goal of this study is to help us to understand the timeline of the response, whether once weekly is the best way to do it or not. It's still perhaps too early to tell, but we will understand whether some subjects respond better than others and over what time frame that occurs. But this kind of research is expensive and it takes years to complete the whole process. So we're also looking for help from our consumers, from our customers, to help us by sharing their stories, by sharing their values if they're being tested, if they have home kits or if they're seeing their GP, to build this evidence that we're looking to develop around our product. And Laura, I'm going to hand back to you at the next slide.
You are. Thanks, Steve. So why have we produced a soup and not a capsule, for example? So in order to put our material into a capsule would require us to create some very large capsules, and you'd need to consume a lot of them, which we just felt was not a sustainable option and not an attractive option for consumers. Why not a supplement? Well, the whole broccoli head contains a range of valuable micronutrients, which we believe are important to deliver the health benefits. And we're using that whole broccoli head in our soup. You're getting it all, which we think is important. And sulforaphane as a compound is also unstable. And there are no supplements in this field that have a health claim to say that it can deliver the right health benefits. We've also touched on why our broccoli isn't available in the supermarkets. And Richard has already mentioned that actually growing a crop will be affected by the different growing conditions that it's in. And as he mentioned earlier, this year has been particularly hot and particularly dry. So it'll be very interesting to see what impact that has on our glucoraphanin content. But the way we're processing our broccoli means that we're able to blend the different crops in order that we can ensure that each portion of our product delivers a reliable amount of glucoraphanin. And the alternative would be then perhaps to eat lots of standard broccoli. But the problem with that is that you'd need to eat an awful lot of it. And what you don't know is how much glucoraphanin is in a standard broccoli that you might buy in the supermarket. What we do know is that generally speaking, the standard varieties contain very little glucoraphanin by comparison to our high glucoraphanin variety. So we felt making a soup, certainly as our first product, was the best option. And what we've been able to do is the way that it's prepared and delivered to you protects its glucoraphanin content. And as we said earlier, we know that cooking can destroy glucoraphanin. And our soup delivers a reliable amount in every portion. And we also felt that, our research thus far indicates that eating 1 portion per week is the right amount. We do want to do more research in this area to see if 2 doses a week would be better, for example. But at least 1 portion a week is sustainable, and it has such a low impact on lifestyle that we feel hopefully it's an attractive option for consumers. We also felt that delivering it in a food as a natural food ingredient is also an attractive option for many. And from a practical point of view, being a dried soup means that it has a long shelf life. It's easy for us to distribute it and bring it to our consumers, deliver it to their door. So they're the main reasons why we've gone down the dried soup route. But I'd now like to open up for questions. So please put those questions in the chat. I can see that we've already got some. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we do have some questions that have been sent to us in advance. So we'll look to address those first before we answer the questions in the chat. So let's just stop sharing. Okay. So the first question that we've been asked is, how has the dosing level been determined in every portion? And Richard, I wondered if you might like to answer that.
I think there are 2 main reasons why we've sorted out that dose. The first reason is this dose has been very effective in a fairly long dietary intervention trial. So we did a trial for 12 months. The volunteers had just 1 portion a week, and it was effective at that, as Steve said, it had aims of both looking at fasting blood glucose and at prostate cancer progression, and that single dose a week was effective. The other reason of that dose is because there's a very large body of what we call epidemiological data, and this is observational data, so it really records what people eat over many years, and it's tens of thousands of people. And we know that people who have 5 or 6 portions of broccoli or other cruciferous vegetables tend to maintain their health and have reduced risk of various diseases, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And so clearly we know that dose is effective from those studies. So we've tried to mirror that in a single portion of broccoli, as opposed to having to have a portion of cruciferous vegetables every day of the week. So those are the two reasons. One is that it's experimental, and the other is based on evidence from many different studies.
Thanks, Richard. Next question. Would it be beneficial to have the soup more than once per week? Steve?
Yeah, I think I can answer that quite quickly because it builds on what Richard said. So at this stage, as you heard, we have seen an effect on blood sugar from that once weekly dosing in the trial. If you go back to the analogy that we've used about retuning your metabolism for gene expression, because it may not be necessary to give this product more frequently to do that. And if you take that retuning analogy, you don't service your car every week. You don't service it every day. You take it in, now and again to get that engine firing and optimization. So we would love to know the answer to this. However, the research has got to go on, and time may tell, and perhaps we'll find something that's slightly better. But for now, it works.
Can I just add on to that, Laura?
Yes, of course.
The other analogy to the broccoli is taking a little bit of exercise. And, we know that having a brisk walk, maybe 2 or 3 times a week is beneficial. Maybe for other people, going to the gym once or twice a week is beneficial. It's not something you probably do every day, and something you not do continuously. And indeed, the science evidence here is having a larger dose, maybe once or twice a week, is better for you than having a lower dose every day. And that's just the same as having a very brisk walk, maybe twice a week, so you get a little bit out of puff, is better than just going for a wander every day. So we think 1 portion a week works. 2 might be very effective as well. But as Steve says, there's a lot more research to be done here.
Thank you. Next question. What is the extent of the research base for glucoraphanin and its potential impact on health? Richard, do you want to take that?
Well, I think Steve referred to this in his slides. I think the evidence that glucoraphanin was having a beneficial effect on health started to emerge in the late 1980s. And so you've really got about 35 years, or maybe 40 years of research on glucoraphanin and sulforaphane. And if you go to some of the big repositories of scientific publications, you can find over 3,000 publications. And the vast majority of those ascribe a very positive effect on glucoraphanin and sulforaphane upon health. So it's a very large body of data. And as Steve says, we are building on that, and our research contributes to that worldwide effort in this area.
Thank you. One for you, Steve. Can the soup help someone with diabetes?
Yeah, an interesting and sort of also difficult question here. The answer is possibly. It's important to remember that functional foods generally aim to help maintain your health, and in the context of you doing something alongside of that, it's how functional foods are conceived, and they're not intended by definition to cure or prevent a disease, which is the area where drugs operate. We think it's really important that everyone listens to their doctor and GP. If you have diabetes, if they say you need a drug, you'd be silly to ignore that advice. But if you are trying, there's certainly the possibility, because if you look at that Axelson paper that I quoted, the subjects who were responding were those with dysregulated diabetes. So don't ignore anything a doctor or GP says to you, but could they work? Could they have some benefit? Possibly, and certainly there's no reason to believe they couldn't help something.
Thank you. So another question was, why does the soup cost a little over £5 per portion? Well, that's pretty much based on the amount of money that's had to be spent on doing the research and indeed the future research that we want to undertake. And processing, when you're a small company working with processors and growers and so on, you simply don't get the economies of scale that we would hope to get in the future. So in terms of looking at what the price might be in the future, well, that's a very hard question to answer too, particularly in the current environment where, as we know, prices are skyrocketing. But, you know, we will look to try and bring down the prices as quickly as possible. But it will be down to volume, and it will be down to how much money we have to be able to put into future research to develop our product. So on the one hand, you could argue that it's an awful lot of money. On the other hand, you could say, well, many people would spend that on a coffee a week or a couple of coffees a week. And if it has a benefit to your health, then perhaps it's money well spent. But that's clearly a very individual decision to make. But that's the reason why it costs what it does. We would love to make it cheaper, and I hope in due course we will be able to do so. Another question we've received is how quickly can you conduct further research? Well, I've sort of answered that in when I was answering the last question, really. It'll be down to how quickly we can raise money to undertake more research. Or if sales go particularly well of our product, then that will help to fund future research too. So very much dependent on what the investment community are happy to do, what our existing investors are prepared for the company to undertake. And the timing of it will be very much dependent on how quickly we can undertake those clinical trials. And clinical trials can take an awful long time. It takes a long time to recruit people, and the studies themselves, by their very nature, usually take a very long time to complete. So there's no quick fix, but what we're very keen to do, as Steve said earlier, is to gain knowledge from our customer base through citizen science, and that will just really help to provide further confidence in the product and what we're doing. Another question, which I will take, is do we have a link with Diabetes UK? Well, the answer is we don't have a formal relationship with Diabetes UK. We have been talking to them. We're very keen to undertake further consumer research on sort of the organoleptic properties of the product and so on. And we hope to work with Diabetes UK on that. But so far that hasn't happened. But in due course, we certainly hope that they are an organisation that we will forge a close relationship with. Another question we've received is, why do we use maltodextrin and glucose syrup in our soup? Well, the answer to that is that we work with leading manufacturers, and to an extent we have to work with the portfolio of ingredients that they have access to and that they use. Once we get a bit bigger, we can wield a lot more influence, but the amounts that we're using in our product are actually relatively small and shouldn't pose a problem, particularly in the context of eating the soup once a week. They should not cause a concern. However, we have received comments about their use, and we have gone back to the manufacturer, and in fact today I've received samples that look at the removal of those ingredients and to see if they are sufficiently palatable for us to launch a slightly revised product. So we'll be hoping to do that in due course, and we'll let our customer base know as soon as that has happened. And finally, we've also been asked a question about what can you do if you don't like the taste? I have to say, you know, in most of our pre-launch research, if you like, people found our product to be palatable, but hey, it's not going to be for everybody. What we do know is that by adding different ingredients can make it more palatable for people. So adding things like pepper, lemon juice. Steve added some tomato salsa to one of his portions and found that a very attractive addition. So I think please try adding various things to the soup if you don't like the flavor of it, or just to make a change. That might make it much more acceptable to you, but obviously bear in mind that what you do add you need to be cautious about in terms of if you are trying to manage your blood sugar level. So now I will open the floor up to the questions we've received in the chat. So let's have a look. So a question here, 7 weeks ago, I have a home glucose monitor and have been monitoring since January. I am pre-diabetic. If you'd like me to share my data, please let me know. Well, yes, please, we would love you to do that. Another question. I sometimes find the bowl of soup too much at one sitting. Will there be any other products in the future? So to answer that question is that we are looking at different flavors of dried soup. That's the first priority. And we're waiting for samples of those to come through. What I can't tell you is exactly when they'll be made available. It sort of depends on how much crop we get this year as to how much volume, and we obviously have commitment to our existing subscribers to ensure we can continue to provide them with product. But it is something we're looking at. We're very mindful of the fact that if you're taking this product for a long period of time, you might get bored of the flavor. You can add it to different foods, of course, being mindful as to what you add it to, but whole wheat pasta dishes or something like that, as long as the portions aren't too great, shouldn't provide a problem. And as I say, you can add your own range of ingredients to it to bring some variety. The next question I've had is, have you rolled out the soup as planned before getting the European claim? Well, we don't have a claim yet. We would like to launch the product in other markets, but we need to get, we can't run before we can walk, and we need to get our product well established in the UK first, which is where we're growing the broccoli and where it's manufactured. But yes, we'd be very pleased to be looking at making the product available in other markets. And in fact, we've had lots of inquiries from people overseas, and we're keeping a note of those people at their consent, and we'll be letting them know as soon as it's available. But getting a European claim will take a long time. You know, you're looking at least probably a minimum of 3 years, and an awful lot of investment to undertake the trials that we need to undertake. But as I say, getting the citizen science, getting feedback from our customer base will certainly help give investors confidence that the product works. Next question. Have you considered asking people who are eating the soup regularly to check their weight at the start of each month on their bathroom scales and send it into your database? Well, that's a very interesting question. So it goes on to say, if glucose control is better, so body weight may also come down a little. Well, it's a very good point. And we are developing our website so that in your own account spaces, we hope that you'll be able to start recording your data and all sorts of things, from your BMI through to your fasting blood glucose levels, your HbA1c data if you have it, how you might be sleeping, a whole range of different metrics that you as an individual might find interesting, and you can keep recorded in your private space of our website, whilst allowing us to have anonymous access to that data so that we can start to track what our customers are experiencing. that would be extremely, extremely valuable. Next question. Are you sure that pouring boiling water onto the soup powder doesn't denature the glucoraphanin? Richard, do you want to answer,
yes,
that one?
We're absolutely sure on that. Putting boiling water onto the glucoraphanin has no effect on the glucoraphanin, which you then consume. And as I say, you could use a soup in certain other dishes. What wouldn't work is if you included the soup in a dish you were cooking in the oven. You know, if you cooked in the oven at 180 degrees for half an hour, you would denature the glucoraphanin. But the way we've produced the soup, you pour boiling water on it, and it has no effect on the glucoraphanin content. And we've got lots of data for that.
Thanks, Richard. So would the use of CGMs, continuous glucose monitors, give a better indication of the time frame for which the product will affect the blood glucose levels? This would also give an indication of time in target rather than just random fasting blood glucose and the variable HbA1c. Well, we are conducting a small CGM study. It's only with a very limited number of people, and we are just waiting for the results of that study to come through. Steve or Richard, do you want to add to that?
Steve, after you.
I was just going to say, of course, if you can wear technology that gives you a reading, it doesn't take your blood, of course, it's measuring it in the fluid between your cells, which lags a little bit behind the blood, but you're getting good profiles and lots of data. It is expensive to use it in trials. These kits will come down in price over time, but they are expensive. But absolutely, to the question asked, the time in range type data is very useful, and I think we'll employ it more and more in the research as we go forward.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Richard?
No, not really. It's a excellent technology. I'm using it a lot in my ongoing studies I undertake in New Zealand. And it is really interesting because one of the risk factors for diabetes is how high your glucose goes up immediately after eating a meal. And it's very difficult to get that from clinicians. But of course, with the continuous glucose monitoring, you can actually see that. So it's great technology. And I think it has real value to play here.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. We're now 3 minutes past 7, and I said we'd finish punctually at 7, but I think we have come very close to the end of the question, so I will just take this last one. What reduction can a consumer expect in pre-diabetic ranges of HbA1c levels, and after how long? Steve or Richard, one for you.
Steve?
Well, I suppose my answer to that would be, you know, it's all very well when you run research to look at what's statistically significant, but what is clinically meaningful is what's important. You know, we don't know what the maximum effect might be, but what we do know is if you can have something that's clinically meaningful, if you can, let's say, reduce your fasting blood glucose level by 5% or your HbA1c level by this, it may not sound a lot, but in reality, these are conditions that develop slowly over time. So if you buy yourself a 5% improvement and you also adapt your lifestyle, that can be very meaningful. So for me, it's about what is a meaningful improvement that you can target with a product like this. That's how I'd answer it.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all the questions. Our time is up. Thank you very much for everybody for coming along to the webinar. As I said, we have been recording the presentation and the question and answers, and we'll be making those available on our website. And certainly to those people that have asked for copies already, they will be sent out to you. So thank you very much for your time. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to email us anytime. The contact details are all on our website, and we'd be extremely pleased to help. Thank you very much indeed.